Welcome. But before we begin, let me ask you a question that might completely change the way you see history. What if one of the most powerful families in human history was not chosen because of wealth, power, or empire, but because of faith? What if a lineage began with a promise from Allah, continued through trials, migrations, betrayal, miracles, and patience, and eventually shaped the spiritual history of the world? And what if that family, known in the Quran as a people tested again and again, carried within it prophets, kings, and messages that would echo across thousands of years? Tonight, we explore a story that many people have heard pieces of, but very few understand completely. This is the story that begins with the noble prophet Ishaq, peace be upon him, and continues through a man whose name would later define a nation, Yaqub, also known as Israel. But to understand this story, we must first understand the legacy they inherited. Generations before them lived the great prophet Ibrahim, peace be upon him, a man whose faith changed the course of human history. Allah blessed Ibrahim with two sons who would both become part of a remarkable lineage, Ismail and Ishaq. From Ismail would come the final messenger many centuries later. But from Ishaq would emerge a family that the Quran describes as being given knowledge, prophecy, and guidance. This is where our story begins. Ishaq grew up in a household filled with faith and devotion. His father Ibrahim had already faced trials that most people could never imagine. Standing against idol worshippers, surviving the fire, migrating for the sake of Allah, and building the sacred Kaaba. Ishaq inherited not just a family name but a responsibility. The responsibility of continuing the message of monotheism. As Ishaq grew older, Allah blessed him with a son who would later become one of the most important figures in the history of Bani Israel. That child was Yaqub. Yaqub was known for his wisdom, patience, and deep connection with Allah. Over time, Allah blessed him with 12 sons. These 12 sons would eventually become the foundation of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is why the descendants of Yaqub became known as Bani Israel, the children of Israel. But the journey of this family was not simple. It was filled with human emotions, jealousy, struggle, forgiveness, and divine wisdom. Among Yaqub's sons was a young boy who would become one of the most famous prophets in history, Yusuf, peace be upon him. From an early age, Yusuf showed signs of intelligence and purity of heart. One day he shared a dream with his father, a dream in which the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed to him. Yaqub immediately understood that this dream held great meaning, but he also knew something else. He knew that jealousy could grow in the hearts of Yusuf's brothers, and unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. As time passed, Yusuf's brothers became increasingly envious of the love their father showed him. Jealousy slowly turned into resentment, and resentment eventually turned into a dangerous plan. One day they convinced their father to allow Yusuf to go with them on a journey. Yaqub hesitated, sensing something was wrong, but eventually allowed him to go. That decision would lead to one of the most dramatic moments in the history of prophets. Instead of protecting their younger brother, they threw him into a deep well. Then they returned home with a false story, claiming that a wolf had attacked him. Imagine the pain Yaqub felt in that moment. A father who sensed the truth but chose patience. A father who trusted Allah even in the darkest moments. Meanwhile, Yusuf's story was just beginning. He was rescued by a passing caravan and eventually taken to Egypt. From there, his life unfolded through a series of events that could only be described as part of Allah's plan. He faced trials that would break many people. Slavery, false accusations, imprisonment. But Yusuf remained patient. Years passed, and eventually his ability to interpret dreams brought him to the attention of Egypt's ruler. What followed was remarkable. The same boy who had once been thrown into a well rose to a position of authority in one of the most powerful civilizations of the time. Then came the moment that would test his character once again. A famine spread across the land. People from surrounding regions traveled to Egypt seeking food. Among them were Yusuf's brothers, the very ones who had betrayed him. They did not recognize him, but Yusuf recognized them. At that moment, he had power. He could have taken revenge. He could have humiliated them. But instead, he chose mercy. This moment would later become one of the greatest lessons in forgiveness recorded in history. Eventually, Yusuf revealed his identity, and the family of Yaqub was reunited. This reunion marked an important stage in the history of Bani Israel, but it also set the stage for future events that would test them in ways they could not imagine. Because generations later, their descendants would face a powerful ruler in Egypt, a tyrant remembered in the Quran as Pharaoh. And this is where another major chapter in their story begins. But that part of the story belongs to the rise of another prophet, one whose mission would change the destiny of Bani Israel forever. That prophet would be Musa, peace be upon him, and his story would become one of the most dramatic and powerful narratives in the Quran. But history was moving toward another turning point. Generations after the time of Yusuf, the descendants of Yaqub grew into a large community living in Egypt. At first, they lived with dignity and security. But as new rulers came into power, the situation changed. A powerful tyrant rose to authority, a ruler remembered in the Quran as Pharaoh. He feared the growing population of Bani Israel and worried that they might challenge his control. Out of fear and arrogance, he began to oppress them. Families were separated, people were forced into hard labor, and a cruel order spread across the land that newborn boys among Bani Israel should be killed. It was during this dark period that Allah began preparing one of the greatest prophets in history. A child was born who would grow up to challenge Pharaoh himself. That child was Musa, peace be upon him. According to the Quran, Allah inspired Musa's mother to place her baby in a small chest and set it afloat on the river to protect him from Pharaoh's soldiers. Imagine the faith required for such a decision. A mother placing her child in the hands of Allah. The river carried the chest until it reached the palace of Pharaoh. In one of the most remarkable turns of destiny, the child meant to be killed was raised inside the very palace of the tyrant who feared him. Years passed, and Musa grew into a strong and thoughtful man, but he never forgot the suffering of his people. Eventually, Allah chose him as a messenger. On a journey near Mount Sinai, Musa witnessed a powerful sign, a burning light that did not consume the tree it appeared upon. It was there that Allah spoke to him and commanded him to confront Pharaoh. Imagine the courage required for this mission. A man raised in Pharaoh's palace now returning to challenge the most powerful ruler in the land. Musa called Pharaoh to worship Allah alone and to free Bani Israel from oppression. But Pharaoh refused. Instead of listening, he mocked Musa and tried to discredit him. Then, Allah began sending signs, miracles that showed the truth of Musa's message. His staff turned into a serpent by Allah's permission, and other powerful signs appeared. Yet Pharaoh's arrogance continued. Eventually, Allah commanded Musa to lead Bani Israel out of Egypt. This journey became one of the most dramatic events in human history. When Pharaoh realized that the people were leaving, he gathered his army and pursued them. Ahead of Musa and his people was the sea. Behind them was the army of Pharaoh. Many believed there was no escape, but Musa trusted Allah. At Allah's command, he struck the sea with his staff. The waters parted. A path appeared between towering walls of water, and Bani Israel crossed safely. When Pharaoh and his army followed, the sea returned to its natural state, and the army was drowned. This moment became one of the most powerful signs of divine justice. Yet the story of Bani Israel did not end with their escape. In fact, their greatest tests were still ahead. Throughout the centuries that followed, Allah continued sending prophets to guide them. Among them were noble leaders such as Dawood, a prophet who was also a king known for justice and strength. His son Sulaiman inherited wisdom and leadership that became legendary. The Quran describes Sulaiman as a ruler blessed with knowledge, authority, and abilities granted by Allah. Under his leadership, a powerful kingdom emerged, not just in strength, but in wisdom and justice. But history continued to move forward, and as time passed, many people among Bani Israel drifted away from the teachings of their prophets. So Allah sent more messengers. Among them were the righteous prophet Zechariah and his son Yahya. Then came one of the most miraculous births in human history. The birth of Isa, peace be upon him. Born to the noble Maryam by the will of Allah, Isa's life was filled with miracles that amazed those who witnessed them. By Allah's permission, he healed the sick, restored sight to the blind, and called people back to true faith. But history was approaching its final stage in the long chain that began generations earlier with the family of Ishaq. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Civilizations changed. Yet the message of monotheism continued to echo through time. And then, in the land where Ibrahim and Ismail had once raised the foundations of the sacred Kaaba, another child was born. A child whose message would complete the long story of the prophets. His name was Muhammad. Born in Mecca, he carried the final revelation, the Quran, which preserved the stories of the prophets and the lessons of past nations. Through this message, humanity was reminded of the covenant, the guidance, and the responsibility carried by those who came before. When we look back at the journey that began with Ishaq and continued through Yaqub, we see more than just a family story. We see a history filled with lessons about faith, patience, humility, and responsibility. A family chosen not because they were perfect, but because they were repeatedly guided, tested, and reminded by Allah. Some among them rose with faith, others failed their tests. But the story itself became a mirror for humanity, a reminder that guidance is a trust, and that history is not just about events. It is about choices. The choices people make when they are given knowledge, power, and responsibility. The Quran preserves these stories so that future generations can reflect on them, so that people can understand how faith shaped the lives of prophets and nations, and perhaps most importantly, so that humanity can recognize that the message brought by the prophets was always the same. Worship Allah alone, live with justice, remain humble, and remember the lessons of those who came before. Because sometimes the most powerful stories in history are not the ones about empires, but the ones about faith that survived across centuries. And that is the true story behind the family that began with Ishaq and became known to the world as the children of Israel.